From the very morning, I felt that something was off. The days seemed to start as usual. I got up early to prepare for another shift, drank strong coffee, and read through a couple of articles from a medical journal to keep my mind sharp. But something wasn't right. Maybe it was just the usual nerves before a long shift, or maybe it was a premonition of an approaching storm. The hospital was filled with the usual bustle, nurses, patients, fellow doctors. I tried to focus on my routine, checking medical records, planning upcoming surgeries, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. It was as if something heavy hung in the air, and I couldn't ignore it. When I entered the emergency department, my heart skipped a beat. Right at the entrance stood a police officer, white, muscular, with a stern face. He was the kind of person I usually avoided on the streets. He immediately noticed me, his gaze cautious, his face stony. At first I thought he was there on business. This wasn't uncommon in our hospital. They bring in patients after shootings, fights, or accidents, but something in his look made me wary. He wasn't here seeking help. He was looking for trouble. "Do you work here?" he asked, without even greeting me. His tone was dripping with disdain, as if I had somehow ended up in the hospital by accident and didn't deserve to wear a white coat. I nodded, trying to stay calm. "How long have you been here?" His next question was even more sarcastic. I answered that I had been working here for several years, and even hinted that I wasn't a novice in my field. But this didn't impress him. He continued bombarding me with questions that grew increasingly personal and unpleasant. In his eyes, there was something that told me, "You don't belong here." The feeling of unease intensified. With every word he said, I felt the tension around me thickening. This man wasn't just trying to verify my qualifications. He was looking for a reason to belittle me, to put me in my place. And that was when I realized this day wouldn't be ordinary. Something was about to happen, and I was at the center of this whirlwind. When I saw that Officer Johnson wasn't going to back down, I felt anger rising within me. I was on the verge of exploding, but I knew I couldn't afford to lose my composure. After all, that was exactly what he was counting on, for me to make a mistake that would justify his behavior. "Are you sure you have all the necessary licenses?" he finally asked, raising an eyebrow with a mocking smile. That was the last straw. I felt a wave of anger rising, but I had to suppress it. Instead, I simply showed him my credentials in silence, smiling coldly. At that moment, I realized that this game was going to be long and brutal. "Don't you think you're overstepping?" His words were laced with venom. I was about to respond, but we were interrupted. A patient was brought in on a stretcher, gasping in pain and bleeding profusely. I immediately switched to my work, letting go of everything that was happening around me. But Johnson didn't leave. He stood aside, watching me with an expression that was hard to describe, a mix of contempt and fear. The patient turned out to be a notorious crime boss, known to everyone, even me. Johnson, too, judging by his expression. I began preparing for the surgery, but thoughts of the man who had humiliated me lingered in my mind. He was about to watch as I saved the life of his enemy. "Are you sure you can handle this?" Johnson's voice was cold, but it no longer held the confidence it had at the beginning. "Better not get in the way," I replied, not looking at him. Plans were beginning to form in my head, but this wasn't the moment to execute them. The main thing now was to focus on the work, to show him that I was capable of more than he could imagine. The surgery progressed, and I saw Johnson's face change with each passing minute. He began to realize that I wasn't just a doctor he could belittle. I was something more than he could comprehend, and that frightened him. The operation was successful, the bleeding was stopped, and the patient regained consciousness, though he was still only half awake. I could feel the tension in the room rise as I finished my work. All eyes were on me and Johnson. He approached me, trying to hide his fear behind a fake mask of respect. "Well, now you understand how important your work is," he began, clearly hoping to soften his tone. But in his eyes, I saw that he understood. He had lost this round. I looked at him with a slight smile. In that look was everything: disgust, victory, and the beginning of a new game. "You know, in the end, I'm just a butcher," I said, tilting my head slightly. "The main thing is that the patient doesn't die before leaving the hospital. And after that, it's no longer my concern." These words were spoken with such naive sincerity that Johnson froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. His face turned pale, and his eyes widened in horror. He realized he had walked into a trap and could no longer control the situation. I left the operating room, feeling the inner tension dissipate, making way for something new. The game had only just begun, and now the stakes were higher than just professional reputation. Now it was a battle to see who among us would prove to be stronger, smarter, and tougher. After that incident at the hospital, I noticed that life around me had changed. The usual hustle and bustle of the hospital was still there, but now something new had been added, something invisible, yet palpable. I could feel someone constantly watching me, observing my every move. This feeling followed me everywhere: at home, at work, even in the cafe, where I usually have breakfast. Officer Johnson. This man had become my shadow. It seemed like he literally dissolved into the air whenever I tried to catch his gaze, but he was always there, nearby. I'd see him in a car parked near my house, or at a window in the hospital. He followed me like a predator stalking its prey. At first, I decided to ignore it. After all, what could one police officer do against me? I was confident in myself, in my reputation. But with each passing day, his presence became more and more intrusive, like an annoying fly that couldn't be swatted away. Thoughts began to torment me. What did he want? Why wouldn't he leave me alone? Did he really think he could prove something? It was growing like a snowball. I knew that Johnson found me suspicious. He probably decided that I was involved in something illegal, perhaps because of the patient I saved. But what exactly was he looking for? His suspicions might have had some basis, and that frightened me. But fear quickly gave way to another feeling, a desire to control the situation. If Johnson had decided to play this game, I was ready to respond in kind. I knew it was time to act. At some point, I realized that simply ignoring Johnson no longer made sense. I saw him every day. His intense gaze became increasingly challenging. He was looking for something, and I needed to use that. One evening, as I was returning home, I noticed his car nearby. He was clearly watching me. I decided to go on the offensive. I opened my car door, took out my phone, and, knowing he was watching, began to speak loudly and deliberately. "Yes, everything is going according to plan," I said loudly enough for Johnson to hear. "The delivery will be on time. Yes, all the accounts are clean. Don't worry, the documents are in order." I could feel his gaze drilling into me. He was clearly writing something down in his notebook, trying to decipher the meaning of my words. This was exactly what I was aiming for. I was creating an illusion for him, spinning a web in which he would get tangled. After that, he began following me even more closely. I noticed him everywhere, at the hospital, near my house, even in the stores I visited. I kept playing my role, dropping small details, hinting at deliveries and accounts. I could see his suspicions growing stronger. This was my plan, to feed him false information and see how far he was willing to go. I started to enjoy this game. Watching his confidence grow on false premises brought me satisfaction. He thought he was conducting an investigation, but in reality, it was I who was leading him by the nose. Several days passed, and I began to think that Johnson had finally decided to leave me alone, but no. He wasn't the type to give up so easily. One evening, after a long shift, I heard a knock on the door. When I opened it, there was Johnson, standing there with a search warrant in his hand. "We have reason to believe that there may be illegal items in your possession," he said, trying not to meet my eyes. I saw his confidence, but I knew it was built on sand. I stepped aside, allowing him to enter. He began searching, methodically turning everything upside down. I watched him from the couch, not hiding my smirk. He was like a child, playing at being a spy, not realizing that his game was doomed to fail. Johnson found nothing. I watched as his confidence melted away before my eyes. When he was done, standing in the middle of my living room, exhausted and disappointed, I got up and approached him. "Well, Johnson, did you find anything interesting?" I asked sarcastically. His face twisted in rage, but he said nothing. I continued, "Don't worry, you'll definitely find something interesting next time. Maybe, for instance, under my mattress." I could see his mind racing, trying to figure out whether I was serious or if this was just another game. He just stood there silently, and I knew that this victory was mine. He was merely a pawn in my game, and now that he realized this, his world began to crumble. Still reflecting on my previous encounters with Johnson, I began to sense that he was preparing to make his next move. It was only a matter of eyes widened in horror. He realized he had walked into a trap and could no longer control the situation. I left the operating room, feeling the inner tension dissipate, making way for something new. The game had only just begun, and now the stakes were higher than just professional reputation. Now it was a battle to see who among us would prove to be stronger, smarter, and tougher. After that incident at the hospital, I noticed that life around me had changed. The usual hustle and bustle of the hospital was still there, but now something new had been added, something invisible, yet palpable. I could feel someone constantly watching me, observing my every move. This feeling followed me everywhere. At home, at work, even in the cafe, where I usually have breakfast. Officer Johnson. This man had become my shadow. It seemed like he literally dissolved into the air whenever I tried to catch his gaze, but he was always there, nearby. I'd see him in a car parked near my house, or at a window in the hospital. He followed me like a predator stalking its prey. At first, I decided to ignore it. After all, what could one police officer do against me? I was confident in myself, in my reputation, but with each passing day, his presence became more and more intrusive, like an annoying fly that couldn't be swatted away. Thoughts began to torment me. What did he want? Why wouldn't he leave me alone? Did he really think he could prove something? It was growing like a snowball. I knew that Johnson found me suspicious. He probably decided that I was involved in something illegal, perhaps because of the patient I saved. But what exactly was he looking for? His suspicions might have had some basis, and that frightened me. But fear quickly gave way to another feeling, a desire to control the situation. If Johnson had decided to play this game, I was ready to respond in kind. I knew it was time to act. At some point, I realized that simply ignoring Johnson no longer made sense. I saw him every day. His intense gaze became increasingly challenging. He was looking for something, and I needed to use that. One evening, as I was returning home, I noticed his car nearby. He was clearly watching me. I decided to go on the offensive. I opened my car door, took out my phone, and, knowing he was watching, began to speak loudly and deliberately. "Yes, everything is going according to plan," I said loudly enough for Johnson to hear. "The delivery will be on time. Yes, all the accounts are clean. Don't worry, the documents are in order." I could feel his gaze drilling into me. He was clearly writing something down in his notebook, trying to decipher the meaning of my words. This was exactly what I was aiming for. I was creating an illusion for him, spinning a web in which he would get tangled. After that, he began following me even more closely. I noticed him everywhere, at the hospital, near my house, even in the stores I visited. I kept playing my role, dropping small details, hinting at deliveries and accounts. I could see his suspicions growing stronger. This was my plan, to feed him false information and see how far he was willing to go. I started to enjoy this game. Watching his confidence grow on false premises brought me satisfaction. He thought he was conducting an investigation, but in reality, it was I who was leading him by the nose. Several days passed, and I began to think that Johnson had finally decided to leave me alone. But no, he wasn't the type to give up so easily. One evening, after a long shift, I heard a knock on the door. When I opened it, there was Johnson, standing there with a search warrant in his hand. "We have reason to believe that there may be illegal items in your possession," he said, trying not to meet my eyes. I saw his confidence, but I knew it was built on sand. I stepped aside, allowing him to enter. He began searching, methodically turning everything upside down. I watched him from the couch, not hiding my smirk. He was like a child, playing at being a spy, not realizing that his game was doomed to fail. Johnson found nothing. I watched as his confidence melted away before my eyes. When he was done, standing in the middle of my living room, exhausted and disappointed, I got up and approached him. "Well, Johnson, did you find anything interesting?" I asked sarcastically. His face twisted in rage, but he said nothing. I continued, "Don't worry, you'll definitely find something interesting next time. Maybe, for instance, under my mattress." I could see his mind racing, trying to figure out whether I was serious or if this was just another game. He just stood there silently, and I knew that this victory was mine. He was merely a pawn in my game, and now that he realized this, his world began to crumble. Still reflecting on my previous encounters with Johnson, I began to sense that he was preparing to make his next move. It was only a matter of time. He had proven himself a persistent adversary, but his persistence evoked in me not just irritation, but a certain intrigue. Deep down, I was enjoying this game where each of us tried to outsmart the other. But what was he planning this time? When I arrived at the hospital for another shift, I was met with an unusual buzz of activity. Nurses were quietly whispering to each other, and the doctors looked concerned. At the center of this chaos was Johnson. When he saw me, he came straight toward me, and I noticed a strange mix of anxiety and triumph in his eyes. "Dr. James, we have an emergency." His voice was sharp, but there was a hint of pleading in it. "You need to help." It turned out that a senator had been brought to the emergency department after suddenly feeling unwell during an important meeting. His heart rate, blood pressure, everything was out of control. Johnson was practically begging me to take on this patient. His pleas would have been almost comical if not for the obvious underlying threat. I knew this was a trap. Johnson wanted me to make a mistake so he could finally have a reason to bring me down. But at that moment, a desire to take on this challenge ignited within me. Not just to take it on, but to come out of it victorious. When I entered the senator's room, the atmosphere was tense. The nurses were rushing to carry out my instructions, and Johnson watched my every move like a predator ready to strike. I remained calm, though inside, emotions were boiling. This was the moment I had to prove that I wasn't just a doctor, but someone capable of handling any situation. The senator lay on the bed, his face pale, his eyes darting around the room without focusing on anything specific. I approached and began my examination, but I couldn't shake the pressure of Johnson's presence. "Are you sure you can handle this?" Johnson asked. barely concealing his cynicism. "Completely," I replied, with icy confidence. I knew Johnson was hoping for my failure. He wanted me to falter, for the senator to die on my watch. But I was prepared. I did everything by the book, flawlessly, not giving him the slightest reason to accuse me. Every step was calculated, every decision justified. The operation went perfectly. The senator began to stabilize, and I knew Johnson was disappointed. But I wasn't finished yet. I needed to turn his own weapon against him. The senator began to recover, but soon after the surgery, he started complaining of strange side effects. The first thing that bothered him was nausea, which persisted despite the medication. Then the hallucinations began. He talked about clowns that appeared in his room at night, about people with white faces and red noses dancing around his bed. Johnson was furious. He started demanding explanations, threatening an investigation, but I remained completely calm. I explained that such side effects sometimes occur. It's a rare complication that no one can predict. The senator, however, was sinking deeper into his hallucinations with each passing minute. His paranoia grew. He began to believe that someone was trying to kill him. It was both funny and tragic. His mind, like his body, was beginning to fail him. One day, when the senator once again started talking about the clowns, I couldn't resist, and, with feigned seriousness, suggested, "Maybe you should invite a circus, Senator. They could entertain you, and the clowns might stop seeming so frightening." The senator looked at me as if I were insane, but I couldn't suppress a smile. "Maybe it's all the caffeine, Senator. Sometimes it makes the clowns seem so real." I made a note in his chart, maintaining the appearance of complete seriousness. Johnson, who was present during this conversation, froze in uncertainty. He no longer knew what to think. His confidence had crumbled, and with it, his entire plan. He realized that I wasn't as simple as I might have seemed at first glance. I was playing by my own rules, and this game was just beginning. After Johnson's attempt to set a trap with the senator, I thought his zeal might wane. But it turned out to be the opposite. He seemed to decide that conventional methods no longer worked, and now he shifted his focus to my family. This was a new level of madness, and he began stalking my wife and daughter, hoping to find a weak spot. I couldn't just sit back and watch him terrorize my loved ones. The first time my wife, Lena, told me she had seen Johnson near our home, a chill ran down my spine. He wasn't just following us, he was searching for something to use against us. This was no longer just a game. It was an attack on my life, on everything I held dear. At first, I didn't know how to react. I couldn't confront him physically. That would only play into his hands. But I also couldn't just let things continue as they were. I began to think through every move carefully. My mind was racing, but I knew I needed to keep my cool in this chaos. I decided that Johnson wouldn't just fail in this situation. He would become a victim of his own game. My family couldn't suffer because of his ambitions. So, I started laying the groundwork for a counterattack that would show Johnson what it means to play on my turf. The next day, Lena told me that Johnson had approached her on the street and started asking strange questions. His tone was disturbingly soft, as if he was trying to instill fear while pretending to be friendly. He hinted that there had been a rise in thefts in the area, and that it would be a shame if she became a victim. Our daughter, who was with Lena at the time, also picked up on the coldness in his tone. Despite her young age, I couldn't let Johnson continue this. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I took out several surveillance cameras I had been meaning to install and set them up around the house and inside it. I knew Johnson would come again, and when he did, he would walk right into a trap from which he wouldn't escape. "We'll have a little surprise for our guest," I whispered to myself as I adjusted the cameras. My thoughts were increasingly focused on the upcoming confrontation. Johnson probably thought he was in control, but I was ready to shatter his confidence. When everything was ready, I waited. The waiting felt endless, but I knew it would be worth it. Every moment felt like an eternity. But finally, Johnson showed up. He arrived in the morning, acting as if nothing was out of the ordinary, with a face that betrayed no doubt. He claimed he was there for a routine inquiry. "Your wife might have information that could help with the investigation," he said, looking me directly in the eyes. His words were laced with false calmness, but I could see his hands trembling slightly. I invited him in, maintaining my composure. Lena was in the kitchen, pretending to prepare breakfast, but in reality, her eyes were tracking Johnson's every move. I, too, was perfectly calm, knowing that every word and action of his was being recorded. "Are you sure this is necessary?" I asked, as if doubting his intentions. "It's a standard procedure," he replied, beginning to ask questions. His voice was full of confidence, but I could tell he was avoiding looking towards where one of the cameras was hidden. Johnson began insinuating that Lena might be hiding information about a crime. His questions grew more insistent and aggressive. He clearly hoped that Lena would crack and reveal something incriminating. But my wife was prepared. She remained calm and answered confidently, not falling for his provocations. "Do you have any evidence that my wife is connected to this in any way?" I asked, barely holding back a smile. I knew he was trapped. "Not yet, but we will find it," he replied, less confidently now, as he finally noticed the cameras. I didn't wait for him to gather his thoughts. Rising from my chair, I walked over to him and turned on my laptop, showing him the recording where he had admitted to the bogus inquiry. "I think we now have some evidence," I said, looking at his face, which had turned deathly pale. Johnson froze. His eyes darted between the screen and my smile, and he realized he had lost. I offered him a choice. Either he leaves us alone, or I hand over the recordings to internal affairs. He stood there, stunned, not knowing what to say. Finally, gathering what was left of his pride, he headed for the door. I couldn't resist adding with sarcasm, "If you ever need a good lawyer, here's my contact. He specializes in cases like yours." His face twisted in anger, but he left without a word. I smirked. "You once said everyone has a skeleton in their closet, so get ready, Johnson. This is going to be fun." After I cornered Johnson, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. It seemed like it was all over, that he would finally understand who truly controlled the game. But I underestimated him. Instead of backing down, Johnson decided to go all in. He began using dirty tactics that dragged me deeper into the muck I had tried so hard to avoid. The first red flag was the articles in the local newspapers. Black surgeon involved in corruption, murders in the dead of night. Who's behind them? These headlines were everywhere. I knew where this was coming from. It was Johnson's work. He decided that if he couldn't destroy me physically, he would try to do it through my reputation. And this wasn't just an attack. It was war. Reading those articles was revolting. People I knew started looking at me with suspicion, whispering behind my back. I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet. But instead of panicking, I gathered my strength. If Johnson decided to hit me this hard, I was ready to hit back just as fiercely. And this time, I wouldn't hold back. I started digging into Johnson's past. It was obvious that someone with his level of aggression and ruthlessness couldn't be clean. I hired a few private investigators to dig up everything they could on him. I needed to know every detail. Small bribes, ties to the underworld, anything. I was preparing for the final battle, where the stakes were not just my career and reputation, but my self-respect. When the investigation results started coming in, I was stunned. Johnson wasn't just a small-time cop hungry for power. He was involved in things I couldn't have even imagined. Bribes, protecting illegal businesses, collaborating with the mafia. It all came to light, one piece at a time. I was glad I had made the right decision to go against him with full force. This information opened up new possibilities for me. Now I had enough material to destroy his career and make him regret ever starting this war. When my wife, Lena, found out what I was planning, she tried to dissuade me at first. She was afraid that I would go too far and wouldn't be able to come back. But I was determined. Johnson isn't leaving us any choice, I told her one evening as we sat in the kitchen. He wants to destroy our lives. If we don't stop him now, he'll do everything to ruin us. Lena nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She understood that this wasn't just a fight between two people. It was a war that could end very badly for us. But she also knew that I wouldn't stop until I had won this battle. I began leaking the material to the local media, backing it up with the evidence I had gathered. The first articles about Johnson were cautious, but they still began to uncover his criminal activities. This was just the first strike. I knew he would read these articles and realize that I was ready to go all the way. When the initial articles about Johnson started appearing in the press, his reaction was predictable. He was furious. I saw how his confidence began to crumble, how fear slowly but surely crept into his eyes. He realized that I wasn't just a target for his manipulations, that I wasn't going to sit back and wait for my fate. I was going to destroy him the way he had tried to destroy me. A few days after the first publications, when the information about his criminal ties became public, I received a message from him. It wasn't a threat like before. Instead, it was a plea for a meeting, a conversation. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Johnson looked pale, exhausted, with noticeable dark circles under his eyes. I could tell he was on the edge. He sat across from me, his hands trembling slightly. I didn't say a word, just waited for him to speak first. "You have to stop this," he finally said, his voice almost hoarse. I can't take it anymore." I leaned in closer, keeping my voice steady and calm. "And what did you think? That you could play with my name and reputation without facing any consequences?" I asked, looking him straight in the eyes. He didn't answer. I could see that he understood the depth of his mistake. "You have two options, Johnson," I continued, my tone turning businesslike. "Either you leave town and leave me and my family alone, or I keep going, and the next publication will be even more devastating." He sat there, unable to say anything. I knew he realized there was no way out. As I stood up from the table, I handed him a gift basket that I had prepared in advance. "This is for you, Johnson," I said with a smirk. "If you decide to stay in this town, maybe you should consider a makeover. Who knows? You might end up on the front page of the next news issue." I watched as his face contorted in rage, but he said nothing. He just stared at me, knowing this was the end. I turned and walked away, leaving him with his thoughts in the basket, which contained a note. "You once said everyone has a skeleton in their closet, so get ready, Johnson. This is going to be fun." I thought that after my last encounter with Johnson, everything would finally settle down. I had given him the chance to walk away, to keep his life and whatever honor he had left. But it wasn't that simple. The news of his plans to return stirred up an old anxiety that I had tried to bury. Johnson wasn't planning to leave quietly. He wanted to reclaim his lost influence, and to do that, he needed to eliminate me once and for all. My sources informed me that Johnson was plotting something bigger. He had hired a hitman. This move wasn't just desperate, it was downright reckless. But it carried all the malice and desperation of a man who had lost everything. Johnson was clearly willing to do whatever it took to regain his power, even if it meant crossing every line. When I first heard about it, I felt a chill run down my spine. But then, I realized I had an opportunity, not just to prevent his attack, but to turn his weapon against him. I had to act quickly. My first step was to contact the hitman before he made his move. I needed to know who he was and what he was capable of. And most importantly, I needed to make him an offer he couldn't refuse. My resolve grew stronger with every passing minute. Johnson thought he was in control, but in reality, I knew his every move. I could feel everything falling into place, creating a picture where Johnson himself would fall into the trap he had set for me. I moved quickly and decisively. Through my contacts, I learned who Johnson had hired. The name meant nothing to me, but the reputation was impressive. This man was rumored to be a master of his craft, with a trail of successful hits behind him. It seemed that Johnson had indeed made his best choice, but he hadn't considered one thing. I was a step ahead. Through my connections, I arranged a meeting with the hitman. We met in a dark, forgotten alley on the outskirts of the city. I knew he would be on guard, but I had a plan that would pique his interest. "You've been offered a job," I said when he emerged from the shadows. His face remained hidden, but I could feel his intense gaze. "You know what that means?" His voice was rough, full of hidden menace. "I do, but I'm offering you something better," I replied, maintaining my calm. "You could take the job, kill me, and get paid. But how about doubling your profit?" I saw him freeze for a moment, considering my words. "What are you proposing?" he finally asked, not hiding his interest. I explained my plan. Instead of killing me, he would pretend to fulfill the contract, but would actually take out Johnson. This move would not only double his payment, but also rid him of a potentially unreliable client. After all, in this business, hitmen had to think about their future. He was silent for a long time, and then he agreed. I knew that someone like him wouldn't turn down such a deal. This was checkmate for Johnson, who had no idea that his own plan was about to backfire. The day came when Johnson expected me to be dead. I went to work as usual, knowing that everything was going according to my plan. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just surviving this game, but had completely turned it on its head. I knew the hitman had carried out his part of the deal, and that day he was supposed to finish the job. Johnson was confident that it was his day of victory. But when the hitman showed up, everything went terribly wrong for him. By the time Johnson realized his plan had failed, it was too late. His own weapon had turned against him. I wasn't there to witness it in person, but it was enough for me to imagine Johnson's face contorted with despair and fear. He tried to run, but he couldn't escape. This was the end. When the hitman returned to me with the report, I was ready to reward him for the job well done. He was calm, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. "Well, you do good work," I said, reflecting on what had just transpired. "I might have a few more tasks for you in the future." He merely grunted, understanding that he now had a steady source of income. All of this felt like some kind of absurdity, as if I had stepped into a surreal nightmare, where the lines between reality and fiction began to blur. I knew I had won, but the price had been high. In a world where every move could turn against you, I was becoming increasingly detached from morality and the law. Several months had passed since Johnson had disappeared from my life. I was confident that the story was over. After I had dealt with him and his attempts to destroy me, everything seemed to return to normal. I went back to my work, to my family, trying to forget the darkness I had been immersed in. But despite my efforts, the shadow of those past events still haunted me. One morning, I woke up with a sense that something was wrong. The ringing phone shattered the silence, and I reached over to answer it. On the other end was a colleague from the hospital, his voice tense. "Marcus, there's someone at the entrance," he said. "He's just standing there, waiting for you." "Who?" I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. "Johnson. He's back." My heart skipped a beat. Johnson, whom I had thought dead, or at least dead to me, had returned. But something in my colleague's voice made me pause. Johnson was different now. Perhaps broken, but clearly not the man he used to be. I felt a mix of fear and curiosity. What could he possibly want this time? What had driven him to return? I got dressed and headed to the hospital. Every fiber of my being resisted. But I knew I had to face him, to look him in the eyes, and find out what he was planning. This was a moment of truth, and I was ready for whatever might happen. When I arrived at the hospital, Johnson was standing by the entrance, just as I had been told. He was unrecognizable. The man before me was a shadow of the Johnson I had once confronted. His face was gaunt, his eyes filled with despair. He was no longer the confident man who had once tried to destroy me. "We need to talk, Marcus," he said, his voice trembling. "This has to end." I looked at him, trying to decipher his intentions. It was clear that he was on the edge. I knew it could be a trap, but I needed to know what he wanted. "What do you want to talk about?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "Meet me tonight. In the park, we need to settle this," he said, his voice growing more strained. I knew it was dangerous. I knew he might try something irreversible, but I also understood that if I didn't go, this story would haunt me for the rest of my life. I nodded, agreeing, and he walked away without saying another word. The entire day, I thought about the upcoming meeting. I felt that this wasn't just a conversation. It was the finale of our game. I needed to prepare, but I didn't know what to expect. Johnson was a broken man, but that made him even more dangerous. I realized that the meeting in the park might be the final chapter of our confrontation, and I had to be ready for anything. Evening came, and I headed to the park. The place was almost deserted, with only a few trees casting long shadows on the ground. Johnson was already waiting for me. He stood in the shadow of one of the trees, his figure even thinner and more ghostly. He looked like someone who no longer belonged to this world. "You destroyed me, Marcus," he began, his voice filled with pain. "You turned me into a monster. I don't know who I am anymore." I remained silent, watching him. There was no pity inside me. I knew he had chosen this path himself, and now he was reaping the consequences of his decisions. "I wanted to destroy you, but in the end I destroyed myself," he continued, his voice shaking. "I thought I could control everything, but you were stronger. You won." I waited for him to make the next move. I knew he was on the brink, and all that remained was to watch. Suddenly, he pulled out a gun. I froze, his hands were trembling, and I could see that he didn't know what to do next, but his gaze was full of resolve. "You won, Marcus, but this time, I'm leaving by my own choice," he said, pointing the gun at himself. In that moment, time seemed to stop. I watched as he pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot shattered the silence, and Johnson collapsed to the ground. I stood there in shock, witnessing this absurd finale. All I could feel was a strange emptiness. As I walked away from the scene, one thought kept running through my mind. This might have been the bloodless surgery I've ever performed. The irony of the moment was so strong that I couldn't help but laugh. I left, knowing that this story was finally over. But whether it ended in victory, I wasn't so sure.